Welcome back, everyone, to Brighter Morning with Bo. Dr. Bo Tiwari is joining us now. He's coming to us live from Washington, and he does have an interview lined up. Doc, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Rishi. How are you? Good
I am
program
good.
this morning.
I am good. You look
Good
great this
program this
morning.
morning. I enjoyed the conversation there with Ira
Yes, quite
on
informative. So
journalism. Yeah,
hopefully you'd be able to have how when you return as well to further the conversation.
yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah,
Maybe you can join me on that one.
of course, for sure. I have no problem with that at all. I see Justin Ram is also with us. Dr. Ram is with us as well.
Hi,
Yes, good
morning,
morning,
Rishi.
Justin.
Morning,
How are
Bo.
you?
Hi,
Yeah, how are
hi,
you
Bo.
doing?
Very well, thanks. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Well, you have had a little tour yourself. You've been all over the world.
Yeah, I spent some time in Europe over the last 2 months, in the UK. Went over to Denmark and Sweden a bit, so it was quite good.
Yeah. That's an interesting starting point, Justin. When you go to places like Denmark, Sweden, Denmark is regarded as a kind of high standard country for the business of governance. It has a very highly ethical uh, and responsive to the people governance system, and it has a very strong social protection part of policy that also exists to a large degree in Sweden. When you go to those countries in this pandemic situation, where there have been different problems, I mean, for instance, Sweden has had some problems with the way they managed COVID. Denmark has been a little better in terms of outcome. But what was your sense there? I know you are a very intuitive person and you're very, very knowledgeable on these things. What was your sense there of going into these societies and seeing them operate now in the COVID, as we live with COVID? What was your sense of that and the structure of those societies going into COVID? Were they better prepared for it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And while going into those countries, I was able to compare what they did with what we did here in the Caribbean, the United
Sure.
Kingdom. And of course, you are correct. They all had different outcomes. Now, I think a lot of that has to do, as you correctly says, with it really relates to I would say, their social democratic model. And while I was there, I was trying to think about what it is that made their outcomes a little bit different. Now, you are correct to say that Sweden had some slightly different outcomes. Perhaps they had more deaths associated with COVID than their nearest neighbors, because, of course, Sweden never locked down completely. In fact,
That's
when
right.
I was there, they had actually declared the pandemic over. So I remember one evening going back to my hotel and there was a party because the pandemic was declared over. But what has also been quite interesting in Sweden is that when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the overall impact on the economy, Sweden actually came out better than their neighbors. So they performed a little bit worse with respect to deaths, but actually on the other end, on the other outcomes, they performed well. But I think a lot of that has to do with the social democratic model, Bo. And what do I
Yes.
mean by that? Is that these societies understand that if you want to run a social democratic model, so there's a bit of socialism, a bit of capitalism, all of that bound up in there, but every individual understands what their responsibility is to the whole. And I got that sense certainly in Sweden. And so, although they might have had those outcomes with respect to deaths, more deaths, everybody understood their responsibility. And so, for example, while I was there, I was asking a young professor at the university that I went to do some teaching, what about the cost of living here? Because I expected it is quite high. But then she told me that, for example, this cost of childcare in Sweden is only about 100 euros per month. While if I compare that to United Kingdom, it can be in excess of £2,000 per month. So there is this understanding that you have costs on one side, but then you actually gain benefits on the other. And those benefits really rebound to the overall benefits of society. And I think that is also what has helped them to manage this pandemic in a way that they can declare the pandemic over now, that their economy did not suffer as much, although they have some questions to now answer as to why perhaps the outcomes on mortality was perhaps not as good as their neighbors. But I think for them, they have managed to weigh up these costs and benefits, and they are happy with their overall outcomes. And that's important for the society and all individuals to understand that.
Yeah, a long time ago, they took the decision that you need strong government and you need a strong social support sector to make sure that everybody, every family, every individual is okay in the society, that nobody is starving, nobody is hungry, nobody is without health care. But they also took a decision that they would encourage, entrepreneurship, innovation. They would encourage investment. They would build global companies. And more than that, they took a decision on taxation, which is to say everybody will pay a significant tax contribution to the state. But when you weigh it against the benefits, you can see where every penny of your money is going. And I think that is what distinguishes those Nordic states from other countries in the world that have tried various experiments. Because of the clarity, I think, strong governments, strong social support system, a capitalist order within a situation in which the government can be a referee, internationally outward in look, export oriented, but at the same time you have a notion of the welfare of the whole, the welfare of the society, and that way they've been able to deal. I mean, the inequalities, for instance, that you have in Western Hemisphere countries, including our own Caribbean, you don't have it in those countries. It is not that you don't have rich people. It is not that you don't have corporations that are extremely powerful and world ranked. It is that in the quality of life of citizens, there is really not that significant disparity in opportunity. Am I correct on that?
You are absolutely correct, and I think when I reflect on it, it also has to do with the overall values of society. So, for example, like I couldn't see this model working in the United States, simply because of the history of the United States and where people really cherish individual liberty. It's not that the Nordic territory.
No, you can. Yeah, I'm saying that I was just interjecting. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah. You can see it now with the behavior towards COVID and masks and vaccination and so on too. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so in the Nordic societies, like I said earlier, they understand what they need to do for the whole. And so there's a greater sense of obedience and understanding that the state, as government, if they say that this is what we need to do, people will obey that. You're not going to get that in some of the other Western societies. And so I really think, even for us in the Caribbean, we have to consider what are our values? What do we really cherish? And can we build our governance and our social contract around that? I think that for us, our sweet spot is somewhere in between what the Nordics would do as opposed to what other Western societies would do. Because we I think, cherish individual freedoms, but I think we also understand what our social responsibilities are as well. So,
Yeah.
I do think now is the time for us to have that conversation and discussion.
Yeah, I really think that the COVID has given us an opportunity to talk seriously about what kind of society we want, what are the values we stand for, and how do we want to go about our business. And, talking about that, Barbados, you talk about the issue of social contract, and I know that you live in Barbados. The Barbados has always been stronger in the Caribbean on this issue of social contract than Trinidad and Tobago, certainly. And even Jamaica, although Jamaica does have a kind of understanding, between government and the private sector. They have a joint organization that manages things like business, etc. But I think what Barbados has been able to achieve over many years has been to create the conditions for social contract between government, business, and labor. And I think eventually NGOs, as they became stronger, became part of that process. You want to talk about that a little bit and where it is now in this COVID period?
Yeah, no, and you're right. Barbados has that very strong tripartite history, and that has actually continued throughout the management of the COVID, the pandemic. So before there is any announcement as it relates to what the government will do policy-wise on COVID, those discussions would have taken place with the representatives of the private sector, the representatives of the labor movement, and maybe to a lesser extent the NGO movement. So nothing is a surprise really to those communities. I mean, and so nothing really is foisted on the population that there would be a violent reaction towards it. So that these decisions are quite well vetted. However, we are of course now seeing some tensions. So, for example, you won't see a public spat, as it were, but you get a sense that there are some tensions between what the proposals are and the policies that are currently being done to manage the COVID pandemic and what the private sector would like to see, because it's been well over 18 months that the country has sort of been in lockdown. We've had curfews. In lockdown mode, curfews for the entire 2021, and that of course has some serious impacts on the nighttime economy, on nightlife, and so on. That impacts certain sectors of the economy quite significantly, and so you are getting the sense that the private sector wants to see these things sort of reduced, so that growth in the economy can continue. But then you're also having this sort of a lot of the policy is now driven by the medical community. And so it's quite interesting, Bo, to see how different factions of society manage risk. It's really an interesting exercise, I think, intellectually, to look at it, how people look at risk and what they think are acceptable risks. And I think that is something that perhaps we need to have more discussions about here in Barbados, to understand risk management approaches and how you bring that into your decision making. And I think that's probably going to be required across the Caribbean as well, because no one is going to be able to get everything they want now, but we have to understand how we go about managing risk and doing that together so that we get the best outcome for the whole, as it were. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this in my columns. The whole business of the emergence of the COVID pandemic was really a miscalculation on the risk possibilities, because it was well known that something like this could happen. Nobody knew when it would happen or how it would happen, but it was known that it was likely. And it was known for, at least in the public sphere, for as long as about 10 years. I know the author of The Black Swan, Nicholas Taleb, had written about that almost 10 years before the pandemic occurred. And we all know the stories of Bill Gates and former President Barack Obama, and the fact that they had brought intelligence to bear on the discussion about, the future of humanity, basically. And these things were there. So even from there, we did not manage the risk. And of course, we had no experience of managing this kind of pandemic. So the management of risk was a high issue in the calculation or miscalculation. And as a result, in many ways, more people died than should have. More people got sick than should have. And even now we have the problem, because part of the management of risk has to do with the way people behave to the requirements of known facts about the pandemic and about the virus, in spite of what they know. So if you have a significant part of your population refusing to take the vaccine, for instance, for whatever reason, and not all the people who refuse to take a vaccine are anti-vaxxers, but if you have a significant proportion of your population doing that, you have a problem in the areas in which that kind of behavior is predominant, and the risks there are higher, let's say, than people behaving with more responsiveness to the vaccine in other places. So this management of risk is a big, big thing. And it's not only for health. I think it's going to become more and more prevalent as we go in the world, because the world is really becoming extremely uncertain. I don't know if you want to make your own comments on that before I go into some of the big issues that are happening in the world. I mean, you are an economist of significant repute. You've been at the CDB. You've worked in the center of London in the mayor's office. So you understand some of these issues from different poles of presence. So I don't know if you want to make a quick comment, and then we'll go on to some of those issues. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that in this time, so at the beginning of the pandemic, there was some uncertainty as to what the virus would do, who in society the virus would affect, who are the most vulnerable. And I think as time went by, we got the data, but we were not responding sufficiently enough to the data to say, for example, okay, if you have some comorbidities, if you are elderly, you are the most vulnerable, and we need to protect you. And so I think if we had worked with that type of data, we could have protected the most vulnerable and allowed perhaps the rest of society and the economy to continue in a safe way. So I think as well, Bo, there was a lot of groupthink that was going on, and I think that this is one of the major lessons we have to learn from this. Is that we can't only have the same type of people, the same mindset in the room making decisions. We have to ensure that persons with different points of view are also being heard, and those points of view are being taken on board when we come to decision making. And that's going to be really important for us as we deal with, I think, the next big challenge that that we have on our doorstep, which is, of course, climate change. Everyone has been speaking about the risk associated with this, as you were saying with the Black Swan and what was written about pandemics. We know that climate change is coming upon us, and we need to start acting now and managing those risks accordingly, because the impacts of that are likely to be tenfold or even quite significantly more than what we have experienced with the pandemic, although the impacts might be gradual in many instances. So I think we have a lot of lessons, but it can't be about groupthink. It has to be about serious risk management and adjusting very quickly to the new realities around us as the data becomes available.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, contending views and contending contending views, contending visions, contending voices are more necessary now because nobody has clarity. And I mean, even there is we've reached a kind of, you might say, academic and intellectual dead end with the thinking because all of that has been disrupted by COVID, whose consequences we do not yet know. And it's not just the virus, it's the way it has altered the way we live, the way we conduct business, the way we behave, the way we think, the kind of values that have been emerging. So I think it is important now. I mean, more than ever, democracy is necessary. But more than ever in the pandemic, you have more and more authoritarian behaviors in many, many societies. And that is the contradiction of what we are living with today because of COVID. How do you feel about that? I mean, do you see it? I see it all the time. I went to pay a bill the other day. My wife asked me to pay a bill. And I went to do the bill, and I was amazed at how the security guard conducted himself and dealt with the person in front of me and then me. And although you have to have systems of order in this time to do this thing, it's just the manner in which things are conducted. So it's not just the government or the state or the public service or people in authority. It's everybody who has a situation in which they have to manage something. I think that there's a kind of authoritarian culture seeping into the consciousness. You know?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And we have to be very mindful that this does not become normalized behavior. That when you go
Yes.
somewhere, you expect someone to deal with you in an authoritarian way. That I think we have to be very, very mindful of. And this is why I think the balance of where you have to understand what the values of your society are. And I think for us in the Caribbean, we value a bit of individual liberty, but we also understand our social responsibilities. I think that that's going to have to be important. And speaking about this whole area of groupthink, I remember once doing a lecture some years ago, and I made it clear to the students that in a room where everyone more or less is on the same page, you have to be brave enough to ask the stupid questions. Yeah, because remember,
That's right.
everyone else in the room, your question is sort of stupid because they are all on the same page, and we need to encourage that, because I think what's going to happen if we don't encourage the asking of stupid questions, this authoritarian behavior is going to become normalized. And someone needs to step back and say, no, wait a minute, this is not right. And we need to be able to encourage that type of, sort of dissent, as it were, because if not, we will be down quite a slippery slope, as you have just experienced in going to pay that
Yeah,
bill.
at the very least, we have to encourage independent spirit and independent thought. I think it would be if you had societies in which everybody was thinking the same thing, I think ultimately you're going to end up with disaster. I mean, it's only a matter of time.
Yes.
Because groupthink leads to disaster.
Yes.
But
The blockbuster
anyway,
phenomenon. The
What you said?
blockbuster, the blockbuster
Yes.
phenomenon, like what happened to
Yes, of
Blockbuster,
course.
that video.
Of course. So, all right, but you led, when you were talking internationally, globally, you talked about climate change. And I myself have been doing some work recently with some other colleagues on things having to do with migration and displacement and so on. And one of the things people are finding now is that, climate change is really a source of new migrations. And if that is hard for someone to understand, if they are not familiar with it, even if you look at a place like California, and this is not poor people migration, you talking about a situation where you have these fires. California also is a place of earthquakes. You have many situations in California where people have just been running from the state and going to other places, and you've had migrations from that state. Think of situations, for instance, where you have the climate change really creeping into your place of residence, your community, devastating that community, whether it is flood, whether it is storms, whether it is volcanic eruption, whether it is some other climatic phenomenon, and what this means for the movement of people. Sometimes it means movement within the country, but sometimes it might also mean movement outside your country, adding to the displacement and the migration phenomenon. So this climate change issue is a very serious matter, having to do with the destabilization of populations.
Yes, and for us in the Caribbean, we've been dealing with that issue. So, for example, if I remember correctly, when Hurricane Maria hit Dominica in 2017, a country with a population of less than 100,000 lost maybe about 20 something thousand people after that.
Can you imagine?
Can you imagine? Those people, of course, are going to other parts of the Caribbean, perhaps other parts of the world. But how does a country now, after losing a quarter of your population, now really recover? It's very difficult. So there are impacts on the receiving country, but significant impacts on the country that has lost the population. Because also remember, yes, remember in Dominica they also lost the Ross University, which migrated away from Dominica to Barbados. So not only did they lose their native population, they also lost this sort of foreign residential population of students who then moved with the university as well. So there are significant social and economic impacts for the country losing the populations as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there are big issues on the horizon too, Justin. I mean, we are reading now about two important things. We're seeing it in some of the prognosticating articles that come up from time to time in which people look at the future. We're seeing it in some of the IMF articles. We're seeing it in some of the business foresighting articles in which people are talking about stagflation. If I could explain that simply, and you could elaborate because you would know these things. Stagflation is really when you have an economy that is not growing, but you also have increasing inflation at the same time. And you also have people warning, the IMF of all people are warning about the potential for a financial crisis and asking people to asking governments to manage monetary policy and fiscal policy and economic strategy very carefully. You have President Biden coming out the other day and talking about the logistics problem and what it is doing to prices. And we know in Trinidad and Tobago, I'm sure you know in Barbados too and all over the region, that everything is almost 100% more than what it cost 2 years ago. And so inflation in that situation becomes a kind of joke because of how it's measured and how long it takes to measure it. But you are living with a situation in which the rising prices are really choking you because your incomes have not been altered. And all of these things, if you take these things like stagflation, the financial crisis, the logistic issues and what it is doing to prices, I mean, what are we in for in the Caribbean? I mean, can we deal with these realities because they are going to roll into the Caribbean as they are rolling in already?
Yeah, and of course, all of this is really international phenomena, which we in the Caribbean cannot
over which
really
we have
get
no
away from.
control. Yeah,
We have no
we have no
control.
control.
So the IMF and I guess academics who are speaking about this are correct that there are significant risks because one of the key challenge we have now is that, as you know, most monetary authorities, so most of the central banks, tend to have as their major target an inflation target. And so they try to control for that. So as with stagflation, you're going to have, as we know, significant inflation is on the horizon, and we could speak about why that is. But it means that the monetary authorities are probably wanting to control that, meaning that they are likely to raise interest rates. With the raising of interest rates, it probably means that government yields and government bonds are going to likely rise because people are now going to be selling off their bonds because no one wants to hold on to a fixed income asset, which a bond really is, if they know that inflation is going to increase. What does that then? And then around that, you have the possibility of, as they say, a stagnation in economic growth, which means that companies are unlikely to grow, meaning that equities are going to suffer in terms of prices. And so this is why we need to manage this very, very carefully because that's likely going to see some implosions in the international financial markets, and that's going to creep back into us. What do we have to do as a Caribbean? I mean, I think it just comes back to what we have always been saying in the Caribbean for a very long time, is that we can never be fully sheltered from the international community, but we can do things to build our own resilience. And that means diversifying, creating some of our own supply chains internally. Start looking at the Caribbean as a single economic space. I always say, look at the Caribbean as the United States of the Caribbean. So if I want to do agriculture, I migrate and I go to Guyana, for example, or to Suriname, because that's where there are competitive advantages in that. If I want to do tourism, well, of course, I go to the Eastern Caribbean and Bahamas, for example. If I want to do manufacturing, where's the competitive advantage in that? That's in Trinidad, that's in Jamaica, for example. Financial services, Trinidad, Jamaica. I think we have to start looking at it like that because that's the way how we diversify the Caribbean. We're not going to be able to diversify as individual nations, but I think we can diversify as a Caribbean, and in so doing, insulate ourselves from what's around us, what's coming. We will always have the impacts, but we want to try to minimize those impacts. And it comes back to that whole risk management approach, Bo. That's how we have to think about it. Mm-hmm.
Well, we could diversify individual countries, but we could never diversify enough. And that's why you need the regional space and the collaborative opportunity that it gives in order to do the kinds of things that you mentioned. We are coming to the end of the program, Justin. I would really like to continue this conversation. And I don't know if you would agree, perhaps in the first week of November, we can continue this. If you would agree, if you're available, I would try to do it with you because you see, it's one thing to talk about the economy of Trinidad and Tobago or the economy of Barbados or to talk about the economy of the Caribbean. But it's another thing to talk about that in the context of the turbulence and the shaking up that is going on globally and the uncertainties that are there. So, for instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Minister of Finance, I mean, although he has done some things here which are new for him, giving significant incentives to the private sector to try to stimulate the private sector to invest and grow, he is also with the left hand. He's doing that with the right hand, but with the left hand, he's still relying on the increased price of oil and gas. And I checked gas last night, it was $5.67. So he's doing well on that account. And again, you see, but checking the oil and gas price with your left hand really means that you are not seeing the urgency of diversification or restructuring of the economy. And this is the dilemma we have in this part of the world, which is that once we see cyclical opportunity, we avoid the hard decisions. And I don't know. I'm going to give you the last word of it because I'm so sure Rishi is waiting for us to go now as we approach the 8 o'clock hour. So you have the last word, Justin.
Yeah. Well, Bo, I think that whether or not the prices of commodities increase, Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the Caribbean has to reform. I think we have to diversify, but we have to work together to do that. And I think we have come to that point in time where the private sector has to lead growth. And that means in many ways the government stepping away and just being a facilitator for that. That's going to be difficult because, as you know, our governments are really like to control things, but they need to understand that it's time for them to step back and let the private sector take control and let them just be the facilitator and do things in a way that facilitates growth. Look at taxations, look at competitiveness, make the economy as frictionless as possible. That, I think, is going to be our major task over the next decade while we build a resilient economy that we can have resilience to climate change and perhaps future pandemics that are likely to happen again. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's have this discussion again,
Yes.
Continue this in early November. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Justin.
you.
Thank you very much, listeners and viewers, for paying attention this morning to this important conversation with Dr. Justin Ram. We'll do it again in November. And I hand over now to Rishi Harinanan at MCTV.
Ram, that's where we end the show for today. Of course, you can join us tomorrow once again from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. for Brighter Morning with Bo. Andrew Chan comes up next with the news.